You've been lying to me my entire life." The words exploded from my 16-year-old son's mouth, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. His hands trembled as he gripped the worn letter he'd found buried in my dresser drawer. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I never wanted him to find out this way. Not like this. Not now. Not before I could explain. The kitchen fell silent except for the harsh sound of Mason's breathing. The afternoon sunlight streamed through our kitchen window, highlighting the dust particles dancing between us like the secrets that had finally broken free. Time seemed to freeze as I watched 17 years of trust crumble before my eyes. "Mason, please," I whispered, reaching for him across the granite countertop, my fingers stopping short of touching his arm. "I can explain." "Explain what, Mom? That Dad didn't die in an accident? That he's been alive all this time?" He slammed the letter down, the paper making a harsh slapping sound against the countertop. "You told me he was dead. You showed me a grave." The weight of what was happening pressed against my chest. For 16 years, I had carefully constructed a world for my son. A world without the pain of knowing the truth. A world where his father had died a hero, rather than abandoned us both without a backward glance. "I have something to show you," I said finally, my voice barely audible over the humming refrigerator. "Something I've kept all these years." Mason's red-rimmed eyes locked with mine, his jaw clenched tight. "More lies?" I shook my head slowly, feeling the heaviness of what I was about to do. "No, the truth. The whole truth this time." I walked to the living room bookshelf, reaching behind the row of photo albums to the hidden compartment I'd created years ago. My fingers found the small metal box, cool to the touch. The key hung around my neck, always with me, a constant reminder of the secret I carried. With trembling hands, I unlocked it and removed a single photograph. For a moment, I stared at the image, transported back 16 years. The photograph was worn at the edges, creased from the one time I'd almost destroyed it before changing my mind. In that moment, standing in our suburban Pennsylvania home, I knew everything would change. "This is why I lied," I said, sliding the photo across the table. "This is what I was protecting you from." Mason's eyes dropped to the photograph, his angry expression melting into confusion, then shock. His hands, so much like his father's, reached for the picture with a newfound gentleness. The color drained from his face. "Is this—" he began, unable to finish the question. "Yes," I answered, watching as my son's world shifted on its axis. "And this is why I never told you the truth. I thought I was protecting you. Maybe I was wrong, but I need you to understand why." The photo showed a man, Mason's father, handcuffed, being led away by police. Blood stained his knuckles and shirt. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was me, bruised, broken, cradling my pregnant belly where Mason grew, protected only by my arms and my desperate prayers. Mason looked up, tears forming fresh tracks down his cheeks. The rage was gone, replaced by something worse, a profound confusion and hurt that cut me to my core. "Mom," his voice broke. "What happened?" And so I began to tell him the story I'd hidden for 16 years, the story of how I'd created a beautiful lie to protect him from an ugly truth, a truth that could have destroyed his childhood, his sense of self, everything. "I need you to hear all of it," I said, taking the seat across from him. From the beginning. The afternoon light began to fade as I prepared to unveil the carefully constructed narrative that had shaped both our lives. Outside, our neighbors went about their normal Sunday routines, unaware that in our kitchen, worlds were colliding and a new truth was about to be born. My name is Rebecca Mitchell, though most people in our small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, just call me Becky. I'm 43 now, though the photograph Mason found was taken when I was barely 26. Young, naive, and desperately in love with a man who wore two faces better than anyone I'd ever known. Before Mason came into my life, I was an elementary school teacher with big dreams and a small apartment on Maple Street. I loved my students, my independence, and the life I'd built after leaving my parents' farm in Ohio. I believed I understood what love should look like. My parents had shown me that. 40 years of marriage, of gentle words and genuine respect. I thought I could recognize the real thing when it came along. Then I met James Anderson at a friend's wedding in the summer of 2007. He was the best man, charming, attentive, with a smile that could melt the coldest heart. When he asked for my number, I didn't hesitate. When he called the very next day, I felt special. When he brought flowers to our first date and remembered every detail I'd shared at the wedding, I thought I'd found my soulmate. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Within a year, married. My parents raised gentle concerns about the speed, but they saw how happy I was and gave their blessing. My mother hugged me tight at our wedding and whispered, "He looks at you like you're his world." I believed that was true. The first year was everything I'd dreamed of. We bought a small starter home in Millbrook, painted the walls together on weekends, planted a garden in the spring. James worked at a financial firm in Philadelphia, commuting each day while I taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary. We talked about children, agreeing to wait until we were more settled. Our friends called us the perfect couple. The changes came so subtly I barely noticed at first. James working later hours, small criticisms about my cooking, my clothes, the way I arranged the furniture, a hint of impatience when I spoke too long about my day at school. Nothing alarming, just small shifts in the atmosphere of our home, like distant thunder before a storm. Then I became pregnant with Mason. It wasn't planned, but after the initial shock, we were both excited. James painted the nursery blue on weekends, assembled the crib, talked to my growing belly, but something changed in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't name, something that made me uneasy in ways I couldn't explain. The first time he hit me, I was 7 months pregnant. We'd been arguing about the name we'd choose for our son. I liked the name Mason. James wanted to name him James Jr. The argument wasn't heated. At least I didn't think so. But something in James snapped. His hand connected with my face before I even realized what was happening. The shock was worse than the pain. He was instantly remorseful, crying, begging forgiveness, swearing it would never happen again. He blamed work stress, fear of fatherhood, promised to get help. And I believed him because I needed to believe him, because I was carrying his child, because I had nowhere else to go. But it did happen again, and again, always followed by tears, promises, gifts, periods of the old James returning, loving, attentive, remorseful. I became expert at hiding bruises with makeup, at making excuses for canceled plans with friends, at crafting stories about my clumsiness when questions arose. When Mason was born, perfect, beautiful, innocent, I thought things would change. For a few weeks, they did. James seemed transformed by fatherhood, gentle with our son, attentive to my needs as I recovered from the difficult birth. I dared to hope. Then came that night, when Mason was barely 2 months old. He was colicky, crying for hours despite everything I tried. James had an important presentation the next day. He needed sleep. The more Mason cried, the more tense James became. I saw it building, the storm gathering in his eyes. "Shut that kid up or I will," he said, his voice low and dangerous. In that moment, everything changed. I could absorb his anger when it was directed at me. I had been doing it for months, but the thought of him turning that rage toward our infant son crystallized something inside me, a resolve I didn't know I possessed. I soothed Mason until he finally fell asleep, then packed a bag while James slept. I took only what we needed: clothes, Mason's supplies, the emergency cash I'd been hiding. I called my college roommate in Philadelphia, who said we could stay with her until I figured something out. But James caught me at the door. What followed was the worst night of my life. The night captured in that photograph Mason now held in his trembling hands. The night our neighbor heard my screams and called the police. The night James was arrested, his rage finally witnessed by someone other than me. Sitting there in our kitchen 17 years later, I watched my son's face as he processed the beginning of my story. The sun had fully set now, casting long shadows across the room. Mason's eyes never left mine, wide with a new understanding that broke my heart, even as it offered a strange relief. The truth, no matter how painful, was finally breathing in our home. "That's how it started," I said softly. "But there's so much more you need to understand." The betrayal didn't end with James's arrest. In many ways, that was just the beginning. The morning after James was taken away in handcuffs, I sat in my sister Allison's guest bedroom in Pittsburgh, holding baby Mason close, my body aching from both physical and emotional wounds. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. James's parents, his brother, his friends. Messages piled up, not asking if I was okay, but demanding explanations for why I had ruined their son's life. "He's never been violent before," his mother Barbara insisted, when she finally caught me answering the phone. "What did you do to provoke him, Rebecca?" Her words cut deeper than James's fists ever had. I had always thought his parents liked me. We'd spent holidays together, gone on family vacations. Barbara had held my hand through morning sickness, had been in the delivery room when Mason was born. Now, her voice was cold, accusatory. "I didn't do anything, Barbara," I whispered, conscious of Mason sleeping nearby. "He's been hurting me for months." "I don't believe that for a second," she snapped. "James told us everything. How you've been emotionally unstable since the baby. How you threatened to take Mason away. How you attacked him first." My stomach turned at the lies. But the worst was yet to come. "We've hired him the best attorney in Pennsylvania," she continued. "We're standing by our son. I suggest you drop these ridiculous charges before you embarrass yourself further." When I hung up, Allison found me sobbing silently on the bathroom floor. She helped me back to bed, took Mason to give me a moment's peace, and called our parents. They arrived the next day, my father's face grim with a rage I'd never seen, my mother's eyes swollen from crying the entire drive from Ohio. "We're here now, Becky," Dad said, holding me carefully as though I might break. "You're not alone." But the isolation was just beginning. James's bail was posted within days. His family's influence in the community, his father was a retired judge, his uncle a state senator, meant that people listened when they began spreading their version of events. According to them, I was an unstable new mother who had fabricated abuse allegations to gain sympathy and custody. The betrayal spread like poison. Friends I'd had for years began to question my story. The principal at my school called to express concerns about the situation affecting my return to teaching. Neighbors who had heard my screams and called police that night suddenly couldn't remember what they'd heard. One even signed an affidavit saying they'd seen me acting erratically in the weeks before the incident. The ultimate betrayal came from Amanda Carter, my closest friend since college. She had been my maid of honor, had thrown my baby shower, had been the first person outside family to hold Mason. 3 weeks after James's arrest, I saw her having coffee with him and his mother at the local diner. When I called her later, voice shaking, she sighed as though I was being dramatic. "I'm just hearing both sides, Becky," she said. "James seems genuinely remorseful, and his family is worried about you. They say you haven't been yourself since Mason was born. He put me in the hospital, Amanda," I reminded her, my voice barely above a whisper. I had 3 broken ribs. "I know that's what you believe happened," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But postpartum can make women imagine all sorts of things." I hung up the phone and blocked her number. One by one, I watched as people I had trusted took sides, and most didn't choose mine. The community I had built over years crumbled around me in a matter of weeks. James's family had money, connections, and a generation of goodwill in Millbrook. I had only my truth, my infant son, and my increasingly frightened family. The protective order I'd been granted seemed like a joke. James, accidentally, showed up at places he knew I would be. His car would drive slowly past my sister's house. Flowers would arrive with cards saying he forgave me and wanted his family back. Each gesture seemed innocent to outsiders, but carried clear threats I couldn't miss. The district attorney called me into his office 6 weeks after the arrest. He looked uncomfortable as he explained that without additional evidence or witnesses willing to testify to previous abuse, the case against James was problematic. James's attorney was pushing for a plea deal: misdemeanor assault, anger management classes, probation, no jail time. "He nearly killed me," I said, my voice hollow. "He threatened our baby." The DA's eyes couldn't meet mine. "I understand, Mrs. Anderson, but his defense has collected statements from numerous character witnesses, including your friend Amanda, suggesting you've been emotionally unstable. They have documentation from a therapist James has been seeing, claiming you've exhibited controlling behavior." I began, then stopped. James had never seen a therapist, but I suddenly remembered him insisting I see someone for postpartum anxiety a few weeks after Mason's birth. The doctor had been a friend of his family. I'd gone twice, uncomfortable with the leading questions, before stopping the sessions. The realization hit me like ice water. He'd been planning this, creating a record, building a defense before he ever laid a hand on me. How long had he been preparing for the moment when I might try to leave? "What do I do?" I asked the DA, feeling the walls closing in. He sighed. "Take the plea deal. It includes the protective order. Get yourself and your son somewhere safe, somewhere far from here. Because I'll be honest with you, I've seen cases like this before. Men like your husband, with resources and support systems, They rarely face real consequences, and they rarely stop. In that moment, sitting across from a man who was supposed to fight for justice but was instead telling me to run, I understood the depth of the betrayal. It wasn't just James, or his family, or my former friends. It was the entire system that was failing me, failing us. I left the DA's office and walked to the small park across from the courthouse. Sitting on a bench with Mason sleeping against my chest, I made a decision that would shape the next 16 years of our lives. I would take the plea deal, I would disappear, and I would create a new narrative. One where Mason would never have to know his father had tried to destroy us both. One where his father was dead, not dangerous. A hero, not a monster. Looking at Mason now, 16 years later, his face pale as he processed this first part of our story, I could see the questions forming. The betrayal he now felt from me, the mother who had lied to him his entire life, was written across his features. But there was something else there too, a dawning comprehension of the impossible choice I had faced. "They all turned against you?" he asked, his voice small. "Everyone?" I reached across the table, and this time he didn't pull away when I took his hand. "Not everyone," I said softly, "and that's the next part of the story you need to hear." The summer heat pressed against the windows as I continued my story, taking Mason back to a time before he could remember, the days that formed the foundation of the life we now shared. "After I decided to leave Millbrook," I explained, "I had almost nothing. Your grandparents offered to let us live with them in Ohio, but I knew James would look there first. I had to go somewhere unexpected, somewhere I could start completely fresh. I told him about Laura, my college roommate from freshman year, who had moved to Denver after graduation. She was the only person I called who didn't ask questions when I said I needed help disappearing. 2 days later, Mason and I were on a bus heading west, everything we owned packed into 2 suitcases. "You were so good on that long journey," I said, smiling at the memory. "Almost like you knew we were heading towards something better." Laura met us at the bus station, hugged me fiercely, and took us to her small apartment in a suburb of Denver. She had already set up a portable crib in her spare room and stocked the fridge with food. For the first time in months, I felt safe. "I'll never forget what she said that first night," I told Mason. "She said, 'Your past ends at my front door. Whatever you need to become, whoever you need to be, that starts here.'" Within a week, Laura had helped me find a job as a receptionist at a dental office, cash under the table until I could establish new identification. She watched Mason while I worked, refusing to take money for childcare. "I had nothing to offer in return," I said, my voice catching. "But she said you were payment enough, that your smiles and baby giggles were worth more than rent." Those first months were a delicate balance of terror and hope. Every time a car slowed near the apartment, my heart would race. Every unfamiliar face on the street would send me into a panic. I'd wake in the night to check that the doors were locked, that Mason was breathing, that we were still safe. But slowly, painfully, we began to build a life. I saved every penny. When Mason was 8 months old, I had enough for a deposit on a tiny studio apartment of our own. It was barely bigger than a hotel room, a kitchenette, a bathroom with a shower that never got properly hot, a sofa that converted to my bed at night, a crib for Mason in what should have been a closet. It wasn't much, I admitted, but it was ours. I hung paper stars from the ceiling above your crib. You would watch them spin in the breeze from the window and laugh like it was the most magical thing you'd ever seen. When Mason was 1, I enrolled in night classes at the community college, while working days at the dental office. Laura would come to our apartment after her shift at the hospital to watch him. I'd return home near midnight to find them both asleep. Mason in his crib, Laura on the sofa bed, and my heart would swell with gratitude. "I studied while you slept," I told him. Sometimes I'd fall asleep with my textbooks, wake up with page imprints on my face, but I was determined to build something better for us. By the time Mason turned 2, I had completed my dental assistant certification and secured a better-paying job. We moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood. I bought him a real bed, toys that weren't from thrift stores, new shoes when he outgrew the old ones rather than waiting for sales. "Remember Mrs. Patel?" I asked, and saw recognition flicker in his eyes. "Our neighbor in that apartment? She used to babysit you while I worked. She taught you to count to 10 in Hindi before you could even say your ABCs in English." The memories came faster now. Mason's first steps across our tiny living room, his first words, his fascination with trucks and dinosaurs. The Christmas I saved for months to buy him a toy kitchen, staying up until 3 a.m. assembling it while he slept. The stomach flu that hit us both when he was 4, leaving us curled together on the bathroom floor, weak but comforting each other. When you were 5, I continued, I had saved enough for a down payment on our first house. Do you remember that little blue house on Sycamore Street? Mason nodded slowly. I remember the tree in the backyard, the one with the swing. Yes, I smiled, encouraged by his engagement. I hung that swing the day we moved in. You called it our forever home, because I promised we wouldn't have to move again. I told him about enrolling him in kindergarten, how I'd stood at the classroom door fighting tears as he walked confidently to his desk without looking back, how I'd worked extra hours to pay for his soccer league fees, rushing from work to make every game, cheering louder than any other parent. That was when you first started asking about your dad, I said, my voice softening. You were 6. The other kids talked about their fathers, and you wanted to know about yours. This was the part of the story that hurt the most to tell. The moment I'd made the decision that had led us to today's confrontation. I could have told you a version of the truth, I admitted. That your father wasn't in our lives, that he had hurt me, that it wasn't safe. But I saw how the other children treated Tommy Williams, whose dad was in prison. How they whispered, how some parents wouldn't let their kids go to his house to play. I had lain awake nights wrestling with my options. Tell Mason his father was a monster who had nearly killed us both? Tell him his father was alive but didn't want us? Or give him a story he could share without shame? A father he could speak of with pride rather than fear? I chose to tell you he died a hero, I said quietly. That he had been a firefighter who saved a child from a burning building but couldn't save himself. I thought I was protecting you from pain. The photograph of James being arrested, the one Mason had found today, had been the only one I'd kept. Not as a reminder of the pain, but as evidence should he ever find us. Everything else, wedding photos, love letters, mementos, I had burned in a small ceremony with Laura, a ritual cleansing of our past. As you grew, I had to elaborate on the story, I continued. When you were 8 and did that school project on heroes, I created more details about your father. When you were 10 and wanted to visit his grave, I took you to a firefighter's memorial in a cemetery 2 hours away. Each lie built upon the last until the story was so complex, so detailed, that sometimes even I almost believed it. Through it all, we had built a life filled with love. I had attended every school event, volunteered in his classrooms, learned to throw a perfect spiral for backyard football games, stayed up learning about dinosaurs so I could discuss his latest obsession, built science fair projects at the kitchen table until midnight. Everything I did, I said, my voice breaking. Every extra shift I took, every night class I attended, every sacrifice I made, it was all for you, Mason, to give you the security, the stability, the love I thought you deserved, to protect you from the truth I thought would hurt you. I had dated occasionally as Mason grew, but always briefly, always cautiously. No one had ever moved in. No one had become a stepfather. I told myself it was because I was too busy, too focused on Mason and my career. But the truth was simpler. I was still afraid. The night of your 13th birthday, I recalled, you told me I was the best mom in the world, that you were lucky to have me. I went into the bathroom and cried because I felt like such a fraud. You thought you were lucky because you didn't know what I was hiding from you. Outside our kitchen window, the streetlights had come on. Hours had passed as I spoke, bringing Mason through the years of his childhood from my perspective. The years of sacrifice, of love, of constant fear that my lie would be discovered, or worse, that James would somehow find us. Last year, I said, when you started high school, I found myself looking at boys your age and realizing you were nearly the age I was when I met your father. It terrified me. I started thinking that maybe it was time to tell you the truth, but I was a coward. I kept putting it off, telling myself, not yet, not yet. Mason had barely spoken during this part of my story, but his eyes had never left my face. The anger that had burned there when he'd confronted me with the letter had transformed into something more complex. Confusion, sadness, and something like understanding. All those stories about him, Mason said finally, the ones you told me before bed when I was little, about how brave he was, how much he loved us. None of that was real? I shook my head slowly. The bravery I described, the goodness, the love, those were qualities I hoped you would develop. And you have, Mason. Everything good I pretended your father was, you've actually become." He looked down at the photograph still lying on the table between us, the evidence of a violent truth that contradicted 16 years of carefully crafted fiction. "But why did you keep this?" he asked, tapping the photo. "If you wanted to erase him, why keep the proof?" It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that would lead us to the next chapter of our story, the one where the past refused to stay buried. "Because," I said quietly, "I always knew there was a chance he might find us. And if he did, I needed to remember exactly what we were running from." Just when I thought our life was finally secure, everything changed again. It was 3 years ago, during the summer before Mason started middle school. We had settled comfortably into life in Colorado. I had worked my way up from dental assistant to office manager at a busy practice in Denver. We had moved from the little blue house to a more spacious home in a good school district. Mason was thriving, honor roll student, starting forward on his soccer team, surrounded by friends. The lies I'd told about his father had become so routine that I rarely thought about their weight anymore. "I remember that summer," Mason said, breaking his silence. "We went to the Grand Canyon. You seemed stressed the whole time." I nodded, surprised by his perception. I was. That trip wasn't just a vacation. The truth was, that trip had been an escape. 3 weeks earlier, I had received a Facebook message that sent ice through my veins. It came from an account with no profile picture, no friends, no information, just a name I didn't recognize. "I know who you are, Rebecca Anderson. Or should I call you Rebecca Mitchell now? James has been looking for you for a very long time. How's Mason?" 13 years of safety shattered with those 2 sentences. I deleted the message, deactivated my Facebook account, and spent the next week in a state of barely controlled panic. I convinced myself it could be a cruel prank, a case of mistaken identity, anything but what I feared most. Then the flowers arrived at my workplace. No card, just a dozen red roses, identical to the ones James had always sent after the worst incidents of abuse. My hands shook so badly when I saw them that my coworker asked if I was having a stroke. "I took you to the Grand Canyon because I was trying to decide if we needed to run again," I admitted to Mason. "I was looking at job opportunities in Seattle, Toronto, even Alaska, anywhere far from Colorado. I hadn't known for certain that James had found us. The message could have been from anyone connected to him, his mother, a friend, a private investigator. But those flowers were his signature, his way of saying he was close. When we returned from our trip, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. 13 years was a long time. Maybe James had genuinely changed. Maybe he just wanted to know his son was okay. Maybe the message and flowers were coincidental. Then came the day that nearly destroyed everything we'd built. It was career day at Mason's school. Parents were invited to speak about their jobs, and I had prepared a presentation about dental office management that I hoped wouldn't bore the 6th graders to tears. I sat in the back of the classroom while other parents took their turns. Mr. Reynolds, the architect, Dr. Kim, the pediatrician, Mrs. Abernathy, the software engineer. "I remember that day," Mason said, his expression darkening. "That was when that weird guy came in and caused a scene. The memory made my stomach clench even now." A man had entered the classroom late, nodding apologetically to the teacher. He took a seat across the room from me, and though I didn't look directly at him, something about his presence made the hair on my arms stand up. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the front of the class on shaky legs, feeling his eyes boring into me. I was halfway through my presentation when he stood up. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent classroom. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm David Carter, Amanda's husband. Amanda, my former best friend who had betrayed me, who had sided with James and his family." The classroom blurred around me. This wasn't James, but it was almost worse. It was proof that he had found us, that he was using others to get to us. David Carter was standing in my son's classroom, 1,500 miles from where he should be, smiling at me like we were old friends rather than the advanced scout for my abuser. "Ms. Mitchell seems uncomfortable," he said to the confused teacher. "Perhaps she remembers my wife Amanda. They were quite close once, before Rebecca left town so suddenly. Left quite a few people worried about her mental state." The whispers started immediately. Mason, sitting in the front row, looked between me and this stranger with confusion. The teacher, sensing something was very wrong, asked Mr. Carter to step outside with her. "I'm actually here to see Mason," he said, ignoring her request and walking toward my son. His father sends his regards. I moved without thinking, placing myself between this man and Mason. "Get out," I hissed. "You have no right to be here." His smile never wavered. "James has every right to know his son, especially since you've been telling people he's dead. That must be quite a shock to him." The teacher was on the phone now, calling security. The other parents were gathering their things, ushering their children toward the door, eyes wide with the drama unfolding. And Mason, my sweet, confused Mason, was staring at me with the first seeds of doubt I'd ever seen. "Mom," he said. "What's he talking about? Who's James?" Before I could answer, campus security arrived and escorted David Carter from the room. The teacher dismissed the class early, and I took Mason home in silence, his questions hanging between us unanswered, because I couldn't find the words to unravel 13 years of lies. That evening, I called the police. They took a report, but explained that no threats had been made, no laws broken. David Carter had every right to visit a public school. When I tried to explain about the protective order against James, they reminded me gently that orders from another state issued 13 years ago had likely expired. They suggested I consult an attorney. Instead, I called Laura. She arrived within the hour, listened to everything, then helped me pack emergency bags for Mason and myself, just in case. "You didn't tell me any of this," Mason said now, his voice tight with hurt. "You said that guy was confused, that he'd mistaken you for someone else. We just went on like nothing happened, because the next day he was gone," I explained. "I drove by the hotel where he'd been staying and his car was gone. I hoped that he'd given up, gone back to Pennsylvania to tell James he couldn't find us after all. I had been wrong." 3 days later, I was called into my boss's office at the dental practice. Dr. Winters, who had been my employer and mentor for over a decade, sat behind his desk with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "I received some disturbing information about you yesterday. Normally, I wouldn't pay attention to anonymous emails, but the details were very specific." My blood ran cold as he slid a printed email across the desk. It outlined my history of mental instability, my false allegations against my loving husband, and my kidnapping of our son. It claimed I was using a false identity, that I was fleeing justice, that I was dangerous. "Is any of this true?" Dr. Winters asked. I could barely speak through the tightness in my throat. "No. Yes, I left my husband. Yes, I changed our names. But it was because he nearly killed me, because he threatened our baby." Dr. Winters studied my face for a long moment. I had worked alongside this man for years. He had watched me raise Mason, had given me extra time off when Mason was sick, had promoted me repeatedly as I proved my worth. "I believe you," he said finally, and I nearly collapsed with relief. "But Rebecca, this puts the practice in a difficult position. Whoever sent this sent it to everyone. Our entire staff, our suppliers, even some of our patients." In that moment, I understood what was happening. James couldn't reach me directly, so he was systematically destroying the life I'd built. Just as he had in Millbrook all those years ago, he was turning people against me, isolating me, cutting away my support system. "We're going to need you to take some time off," Dr. Winters continued, not meeting my eyes. "Paid leave, of course, while we sort this out. But Rebecca, some of the staff are uncomfortable. There are liability issues if you're using a false identity." I walked out of that office feeling 16 years of security crumbling beneath my feet. In the parking lot, I found my car vandalized. "Liar" scratched into the driver's door. By the time I picked Mason up from school, the whispers had reached there too. The other mothers who normally chatted with me at pickup stood in tight clusters, conversations stopping when I approached. Mason's soccer coach pulled me aside to explain that, given the circumstances, perhaps Mason should skip practice that week. "What circumstances?" I demanded. "Look, Ms. Mitchell, or whoever you are, I don't want to get in the middle of a custody dispute," he said uncomfortably. "But when a parent is accused of kidnapping, we have to be careful." That night, as Mason slept, unaware that his world was imploding, I sat at our kitchen table with Laura and made the hardest decision of my life. "We have to leave again," Laura said softly. "You know that, right? He's not going to stop." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "But where? How?" Mason has friends here, a life. I can't just tear him away from everything he knows. And he's old enough now to ask questions I don't know how to answer. Then perhaps, Laura suggested, it's time to tell him the truth. I had refused, convinced that the truth would devastate him. Instead, I told Mason we were taking another vacation, an extended road trip to California. I withdrew him from school, citing a family emergency. I took an indefinite leave from work, and I began methodically cutting ties to the life we'd spent 13 years building. That vacation to San Francisco, Mason said, his voice barely audible. That's why we never went back to Denver, why we suddenly moved here to Pittsburgh. Yes, I admitted. I thought we'd be safer here, close to your Aunt Allison. I thought after 16 years, no one in Pittsburgh would recognize me. I thought we'd finally lost him. I had been wrong again. The letter Mason had found today, the one that started this whole confrontation, had arrived yesterday. I had hidden it in my dresser drawer, planning to destroy it later. It was from James's attorney, stating that James had confirmed our location and was filing for custody of his kidnapped son. It detailed how I would be exposed as a liar, how my false allegations would be revealed, how character witnesses would testify to James's reformation, and my instability. I was trying to figure out how to tell you everything when you found the letter, I finished, my voice raw from hours of talking. I never wanted you to learn the truth this way. I thought I was protecting you all these years, but maybe I was just protecting myself from having to face what happened. Outside, night had fully fallen. The kitchen where we sat was illuminated only by the light above the sink, casting long shadows across Mason's face as he processed 16 years of lies told in the name of love and protection. All this time, he said finally, I've been telling people my dad died a hero. I've been proud of him. And he's been, what? Looking for us? Trying to destroy you? I nodded, unable to speak through my tears. And now he wants custody of me? Mason's voice rose, cracking with emotion. He doesn't even know me. He doesn't want you, I said, the hardest truth of all. He wants to hurt me, and taking you would be the surest way to do that. Mason stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, I thought he was going to walk away, to retreat to his room to process everything alone. Instead, he circled the table and did something he hadn't done since he was much younger. He wrapped his arms around me and held on tight. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered against my hair. I'm so sorry you went through all of that. I'm sorry I said you lied. I mean, you did, but I understand why. I held him close. This child who was quickly becoming a man, and felt 16 years of secrets finally lifting from my shoulders. The truth was out now, for better or worse. What we would do next, how we would face what was coming, those were questions for tomorrow. For now, in this moment, we held each other in the dim kitchen light, survivors of a past that had finally caught up to us. Dawn broke over our Pittsburgh neighborhood, pale light filtering through the kitchen windows. Neither Mason nor I had slept much. After our conversation, he had retreated to his room for a few hours, needing space to process everything. I had respected that, sitting motionless at the kitchen table, mentally exhausted but too wired to sleep. Around 3 a.m., he had come back downstairs. Without a word, he made us both hot chocolate, the way I used to make it for him after nightmares when he was small, and sat across from me again. I have questions, he said simply. We talked through the night, him asking, me answering with complete honesty for the first time in his life. No more protective lies, no more carefully edited versions of reality. The full, unvarnished truth about who his father was, what had happened, why we had run, how we had lived in fear for so long. Now, as morning light transformed our kitchen, something was changing within me as well. The weight of 16 years of lying, hiding, and looking over my shoulder had taken its toll in ways I hadn't fully recognized until I finally spoke the truth aloud. With each question Mason asked, with each honest answer I gave, I felt something shift inside me, from fear to something else, something stronger. I placed 2 mugs of coffee on the table, sliding one toward Mason. At 16, he rarely slept well anyway, and today of all days seemed to warrant breaking the no coffee until you're older rule. What do we do now? He asked, wrapping his hands around the mug. It was the question that had haunted me since yesterday, since seeing that letter from James's attorney. The old me, the one who had been running for 16 years, immediately thought of flight. We could leave tonight, head west again, start over in Oregon or Washington. New names, new story, new life. But looking at Mason now, seeing the exhaustion and confusion in his eyes, I knew I couldn't ask that of him again. He deserved better than a life of running, of lies, of constantly looking over his shoulder. He deserved the chance to finish high school with his friends, to go to college, to live without the shadow of his father's violence or his mother's fear hanging over him. "We stop running," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "We fight." Mason's eyebrows shot up. "Fight? How? You said his family has money, connections. You said the system failed you last time." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee before answering. "All of that is true, but things are different now. I'm different." The Rebecca who fled Pennsylvania 16 years ago had been broken, isolated, and terrified. She had believed James's lawyer when he said no one would believe her. She had accepted the prosecutor's assessment that she couldn't win. She had run because she saw no other choice. But the woman I had become, the one who had built a life from nothing, who had raised a son alone, who had advanced in her career through sheer determination, she wasn't so easily intimidated anymore. "First," I said, "we need legal help. Real help, not whatever overworked public defender I had back then." I reached for my phone and pulled up a contact I'd saved years ago, but never had the courage to call. Catherine Zhao, a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases. Laura had introduced us at a fundraiser in Denver, and Catherine had given me her card with a knowing look that suggested she saw past my carefully constructed facade. I should have called her years ago, I admitted, but I was afraid that acknowledging I might need legal help someday was admitting that he might find us. I sent a text, brief but urgent, requesting an appointment. Then I looked back at Mason, whose expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching determination. "What can I do?" he asked. His question caught me off guard. For 16 years, I had seen my role as his protector, the shield between him and the harsh realities of our situation. It had never occurred to me that he might want to protect me in return, that he might want to fight alongside me rather than be sheltered from the battle. "You can start by telling me what you want," I said carefully. "This affects your life too, Mason. If James pursues this custody claim, you'll likely have to meet him, talk to him. A judge might ask for your preferences." Mason's jaw tightened, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it momentarily took my breath away. But unlike James, whose tension had always preceded violence, Mason's determination seemed rooted in something else, a desire to protect, not to harm. "I don't want to live with him," he said firmly. "I don't even want to meet him." Relief washed over me, followed immediately by guilt. I should have given him the chance to make his own decision years ago, instead of constructing elaborate fictions I thought would protect him. "There's something else we need to do," I continued, pulling my laptop from the counter. "We need to get ahead of whatever story James is planning to spread. Last time he isolated me before I even knew what was happening. This time, we're not giving him that chance." I opened my email and began composing messages to Mason's school principal, my boss at the dental office where I now worked, our closest friends and neighbors. The messages were nearly identical. A brief, factual account of my history with James, the abuse I had escaped, my reasons for changing our names and moving across the country. No dramatic details, no accusations beyond what I could prove, just the unvarnished truth I should have shared long ago. "Are you sure about this?" Mason asked, reading over my shoulder. "Telling everyone?" I nodded. Secrets gave him power. The truth might be our best weapon. My phone pinged with a response from Catherine Zhao. She could see me tomorrow morning at her Pittsburgh office. She remembered meeting me in Denver and had wondered about my sudden departure. As I confirmed the appointment, another message arrived, this one from an unknown number. My finger hovered over it, hesitant to open what might be another threat. Mason reached over and tapped the screen for me. "Rebecca, it's been a long time. I think it's time for Mason to know his real father, don't you? We should talk before things get unpleasant. I'm in Pittsburgh. Let's meet." It was signed simply, J. Mason's hand found mine across the table, squeezing gently. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Mom." Looking into his eyes, so like his father's in color but so different in the compassion that lived there, I felt the last vestiges of the terrified young mother I had once been falling away. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had survived not just abuse, but 16 years of vigilance, 16 years of rebuilding, 16 years of loving this remarkable human being across from me. No, I agreed. I don't have to do it alone, and neither do you. I didn't respond to James's message. Instead, I sent the emails I had drafted, each one ending the same way. I am no longer running, and I am no longer hiding. I am not ashamed of what I did to protect my son. With each message sent, I felt a new resolve hardening within me. James had spent 16 years looking for us, thinking of new ways to hurt me, planning his revenge. But in those same 16 years, I had been growing stronger than he could possibly imagine. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood we had called home for the past 3 years, the house we might have to fight to keep, the life we would definitely have to fight to protect. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, joining me at the window. "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that I've spent 16 years being afraid of a monster, but monsters thrive in darkness and shadows. Maybe it's time we drag this one into the light." For the first time since finding that letter, Mason smiled, a small, grim smile that spoke of determination rather than happiness. "I think you're right." Together we stood at the window, watching the sun rise fully over our neighborhood. Whatever came next, we would face it together. No more running, no more hiding, no more fear. The waiting room of Catherine Zhao's law office was sleek and modern, with none of the intimidating dark wood and leather I'd always associated with legal spaces. Catherine herself was a stark contrast to the older male attorneys I'd dealt with 16 years ago. 40-something, sharply dressed, with a direct gaze that missed nothing. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice," I said, as Mason and I settled into the chairs across from her desk. "Your message was concerning," she replied, her eyes flicking to Mason and back to me. "You mentioned an emergency custody situation?" Over the next hour, I laid out our entire history, the abuse, the escape, the years in hiding, and now James's reappearance in our lives. Catherine listened without interruption, taking occasional notes, her expression revealing nothing. "May I see the letter your son found?" she asked when I'd finished. I slid the creased paper across her desk. She read it slowly, then placed it down with deliberate care. "This is a serious situation, Ms. Mitchell," she said. "Or should I call you Ms. Anderson?" "Mitchell," I said firmly. "I legally changed our names 5 years ago." Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. "You obtained a legal name change? Not just using aliases?" I nodded. When Mason was 11, I finally saved enough to hire an attorney in Denver. We went through the courts, did everything properly. A small smile touched Catherine's lips. "That's very good news. It means you weren't evading any legal custody arrangements. Since there was no formal custody agreement in place when you left Pennsylvania, and since you subsequently obtained legal name changes, this weakens his claim of kidnapping considerably." For the first time, a flicker of hope ignited within me. "Does that mean he can't take Mason?" "It's not that simple," Catherine cautioned, "but it's certainly helpful." "What about the protective order that was in place when you left Pennsylvania?" "It was temporary," I admitted. 60 days. I left before it expired. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "And in the 16 years since, has James made any attempt to establish paternity or seek custody through the courts?" "No," I said. "Nothing. Just finding us, threatening me." "That works in our favor as well," she said, making another note. "Now, about this photograph you mentioned, the one your son found. May I see it?" I hesitated, then reached into my purse and withdrew the photograph. 16 years hadn't faded it much. James being led away in handcuffs, blood on his knuckles, me in the background, visibly pregnant and injured. Catherine studied it carefully. "This is compelling evidence of the violence you experienced. Do you have any other documentation from that time? Medical records? Police reports?" I shook my head. "I left everything behind when we ran." "That's understandable," Catherine assured me. "But it means we'll need to build our case from scratch. Mason, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you some questions now." Mason straightened in his chair. "Of course. First, how old are you now?" 16, he answered. "And you've just learned the truth about your father yesterday. Is that correct?" Mason nodded. "Yes. I always thought he died when I was a baby. Given what you know now, how do you feel about potentially meeting your biological father?" Mason's jaw set in that determined way I'd seen yesterday. I don't want to meet him. I don't want anything to do with him. Catherine nodded, her expression softening slightly. That's your right. At 16, the court will give substantial weight to your preferences. However, I should prepare you. If this goes to court, a judge might still order some form of supervised visitation, at least initially. The thought made my stomach turn, but Catherine continued before I could protest. Before we discuss strategy further, there's something important I need to tell you both, she said, folding her hands on her desk. When you messaged me yesterday, Rebecca, I did some preliminary research on James Anderson. What I found might change our approach significantly. She turned her computer screen toward us and pulled up a news article from a Pennsylvania newspaper. The headline read, "Local financial advisor charged in $1 million fraud scheme." This is from 8 years ago, Catherine explained. James Anderson, your ex-husband, was charged with defrauding clients of his financial advisory firm. He allegedly took investments from clients, primarily elderly individuals, and used the money to fund his own lifestyle. I stared at the screen in shock. James had always been materialistic, obsessed with appearances, but I hadn't imagined him capable of this kind of crime. What happened? I asked, barely able to form the words. Catherine clicked to another article. He took a plea deal, served 4 years in federal prison, was released 2 years ago. The room seemed to spin around me. He was in prison? All that time we were running, hiding, looking over our shoulders? He was in prison. For part of it, yes, Catherine confirmed. From what I can tell, he was incarcerated from 2017 to 2021. Mason leaned forward. So when that guy showed up at my school, when we had to leave Denver, James was likely just out of prison, Catherine finished for him. And apparently, finding you two became his priority upon release. I felt lightheaded, trying to absorb this new information. Does this help us? The fact that he's a convicted felon? Immensely, Catherine said, her expression brightening. A recent federal fraud conviction involving taking advantage of vulnerable people? No judge is going to look favorably on that in a custody case, especially combined with the history of domestic violence. She closed the articles and turned back to us. But there's more. When I saw these articles, I reached out to a colleague in Pennsylvania who has contacts in the prosecutor's office there. Your ex-husband's probation has specific conditions, one of which is that he remain in Pennsylvania. He's in Pittsburgh, I said. He texted me yesterday saying he's here and wants to meet. Catherine's smile was sharp. Then he's in violation of his probation. That gives us significant leverage. For the first time since finding the letter, I felt a weight lifting. James wasn't the powerful, connected man I'd feared for 16 years. He was a convicted felon on probation, breaking the conditions of his release to pursue a vendetta against me. What do we do now? I asked. First, Catherine said, we document everything. The text he sent you, any other communications. Second, we file for a new protective order here in Pittsburgh, based on both the history of abuse and the current harassment. Third, we contact his probation officer in Pennsylvania to report that he's violated the terms of his release. She paused, studying my face. But before we do any of that, there's something you need to consider carefully. If we report his probation violation, he'll likely be sent back to prison. That would solve the immediate custody threat, but it might just delay the inevitable. When he gets out again, he could restart this whole process. Are you prepared for that? The question hung in the air between us. For 16 years, I had been running from James. For 16 years, I had been looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to find us. The thought of having a few years of peace while he was back in prison was tempting. But Catherine was right. It would only be delaying the inevitable. Mason spoke before I could. No, he said firmly. I don't want to spend the next few years waiting for him to get out and come after us again. I want this to be over, permanently. I looked at my son with a mixture of pride and surprise. When had this thoughtful young man replaced the little boy I'd been so desperate to protect? Mason's right, I agreed. I don't want to just delay this. I want to resolve it. Catherine nodded, clearly approving of our decision. In that case, I recommend a more comprehensive approach. We still document everything and file for the protective order, but instead of immediately reporting the probation violation, we use it as leverage. Leverage, I repeated. We offer him a deal, Catherine explained. He signs away all parental rights to Mason, agrees to a permanent no-contact order for both of you, and in exchange, We don't report his probation violation. It seemed too simple, too easy after years of fear. Would he agree to that? Catherine's expression turned calculating. Men like James are primarily motivated by self-interest. Prison is unpleasant. Given the choice between giving up his vendetta against you or returning to federal custody, I think he'll make the practical choice. Mason was watching me carefully. What do you think, Mom? I took a deep breath, considering the option before us. It feels like letting him off the hook. It's not about punishment, Catherine said gently. It's about ensuring your safety and Mason's future. Sometimes the cleanest solution is the best one. She was right, I realized. This wasn't about justice for what James had done to me all those years ago. It was about protecting Mason now, about finally ending the shadow that had hung over our lives for 16 years. Let's do it, I decided. But what if he refuses? Then we proceed with Plan B, Catherine said, her voice hardening. We report the probation violation, file for the protective order, and prepare for a legal battle. But given what I know about men like him, I don't think it will come to that. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. As we left Catherine's office an hour later, after discussing details and signing preliminary paperwork, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of control. For so long, James had held power over me through fear, through the threat of what he might do if he found us. Now, armed with the knowledge Catherine had uncovered, I had leverage of my own. Walking to the car with Mason beside me, I realized something else had changed as well. The secrecy that had defined our relationship for 16 years had evaporated. For the first time, my son truly knew me. Not just the carefully constructed version of myself I'd presented all these years, but the full, complicated truth of who I was and what I'd done to protect him. "You okay?" Mason asked as we got into the car. I looked at him. This remarkable young man who had absorbed 16 years of lies and the truth behind them in less than 24 hours, and somehow emerged stronger. "Actually," I said, surprise coloring my voice, "I think I am. For 16 years, I had been defined by fear. Fear of James finding us. Fear of Mason learning the truth. Fear of everything I'd built crumbling around me. But sitting there, I realized that the worst had already happened. James had found us. Mason knew the truth. And yet, we were still standing, still fighting. And for the first time since I'd fled Pennsylvania, with an infant Mason in my arms, I wasn't afraid anymore. Over the next 3 days, Catherine and her team moved with impressive efficiency. The petition for a protective order was filed. Documents were prepared outlining our proposed agreement for James, relinquishment of parental rights in exchange for our silence about his probation violation. Catherine had even arranged for a neutral mediator to facilitate the meeting where these terms would be presented. Throughout this whirlwind of legal activity, a strange calm had settled over me. After 16 years of running, of looking over my shoulder, of constructing elaborate lies to protect my son, the simple act of facing the threat head-on felt remarkably liberating. Mason and I had spent those 3 days in intense conversation, filling in the gaps of our shared history that had been obscured by my protective lies. He asked about his grandparents, James's parents, and I told him the truth about their role in enabling their son's behavior. He asked about the few early baby photos he had, and I explained the real circumstances behind each one. It was painful, but cleansing, like draining an old wound that had festered too long. On the morning of the scheduled meeting with James, I stood in my bedroom, considering my reflection in the mirror. What does one wear to face their abuser after 16 years? I had cycled through multiple outfits before settling on a simple charcoal gray pantsuit, professional, dignified, armor-like in its structured shoulders and crisp lines. "You look strong," Mason said from the doorway. He had insisted on coming to the meeting, despite my initial objections. Catherine had supported him, arguing that his presence would reinforce our united front and remind James exactly what he stood to lose. "I feel strong," I replied, surprised to discover it was true. Stronger than I've felt in a very long time. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. She was waiting outside in her car, ready to drive us to the mediator's office. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. In exactly 1 hour, I would be face to face with the man who had haunted my nightmares for 16 years. "Ready?" Mason asked. I took one last look in the mirror. The woman who stared back bore little resemblance to the terrified young mother who had fled Pennsylvania with an infant. My hair was different, shorter, and with strands of silver I no longer bothered to color. Lines had formed at the corners of my eyes and mouth, some from worry, others from laughter. My posture was straight, confident, a far cry from the hunched defensiveness I had carried for so long. "Ready," I confirmed. The drive to the mediator's office was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Catherine reviewed our strategy one final time, emphasizing that Mason and I should let her do most of the talking. "Remember," she said as we pulled into the parking lot, "we have the leverage here. He's in violation of his probation just by being in Pittsburgh. No matter what he says, no matter how he tries to intimidate you, remember that we hold the stronger position." The mediator's office was in a nondescript building downtown. As we walked through the lobby, I felt a momentary surge of panic. What if James refused our terms? What if he became violent? What if... Mason's hand slipped into mine, squeezing gently. "We've got this, Mom." His quiet confidence steadied me. Together, we followed Catherine into an elevator and up to the 5th floor. The mediator, a gray-haired woman named Ms. Patel, greeted us at the reception area. "Mr. Anderson has not yet arrived," she informed us. "Please, come this way." She led us to a conference room with a large table and comfortable chairs. Water pitchers and glasses were arranged neatly in the center. Catherine took a seat on one side, gesturing for Mason and me to join her. Ms. Patel explained that she would bring James in once he arrived, and that she would remain present throughout the discussion to ensure it remained civil. "I understand there is a history of violence," she said, her eyes meeting mine with compassion. "Please be assured that security has been notified and is on standby." I nodded my appreciation, though the knowledge did little to calm the flutter of nerves in my stomach. We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the gentle humming of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers as Catherine organized her documents. Then came a knock at the door. "Mr. Anderson has arrived," Ms. Patel announced, stepping back into the room. And suddenly, there he was. 16 years had changed James as much as they had changed me. His once dark hair was thinner now, receding at the temples and threaded with gray. Lines creased his face, deeper than mine, hardening his once handsome features. Prison had left its mark in the wary set of his shoulders, the calculating look in his eyes. He was dressed in an expensive suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, as though he had lost weight recently. Our eyes met across the room, and for a heartbeat, I was 26 again, terrified, trapped, certain he could destroy me with a single blow. Then I felt Mason shift beside me, and the moment passed. I wasn't that woman anymore, and James wasn't the powerful monster of my memories. He was just a man, a flawed, dangerous man, but nothing more than that. James's eyes moved from me to Mason, widening slightly as he took in his son's appearance. I saw the recognition there. Mason had his father's eyes, his jawline, his height. For 16 years I had seen these similarities and feared them. Now, watching James process the reality of the son he had never known, I realized something important. Mason might have inherited his father's physical traits, but everything else, his character, his compassion, his strength, those came from elsewhere. From me, from the life we had built together. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Anderson," Ms. Patel directed, gesturing to the chair opposite us. James moved with deliberate casualness, taking his time to button his jacket before sitting, arranging himself as though this were a business meeting rather than a confrontation 16 years in the making. His lawyer, a thin man with nervous hands, sat beside him. "Rebecca," James said, my name in his mouth like something distasteful. "You're looking... Well," Catherine placed a warning hand on my arm, but I didn't need it. His attempt to unsettle me felt pathetic rather than threatening. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Catherine interjected. "We're here to discuss a very specific proposal." James's eyes never left mine. "Aren't you going to introduce me to my son?" Mason stiffened beside me. Before Catherine could intervene, he spoke, his voice steady and cold. "I know who you are. I know what you did to my mother. I'm only here because it was legally necessary." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even hurt, crossed James's face before his expression hardened again. "You've poisoned him against me," he said to me, filled his head with lies. "Actually," I replied evenly, "I spent 16 years lying to protect him from the truth about you. It's only in the past few days that he's learned who you really are." James's lawyer cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on the matter at hand." My client is seeking to establish a relationship with his son, from whom he has been wrongfully separated for 16 years. Catherine's smile was razor sharp as she slid a folder across the table. Before we get to that, I think there's something your client needs to consider. The lawyer opened the folder, scanning the contents with growing alarm. James leaned over to see, his confident expression faltering. As you can see, Catherine continued, we've documented your client's presence in Pittsburgh, which is a clear violation of his probation terms following his federal fraud conviction. We're prepared to report this violation immediately, unless Mr. Anderson is willing to consider our proposal. The lawyer whispered urgently to James, whose face had gone pale beneath its prison pallor. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes. He had come here thinking he held all the cards, only to discover his hand was weaker than he'd imagined. What proposal? He asked, his voice tight. Catherine slid another document across the table. It's quite simple. You sign away all parental rights to Mason. You agree to a permanent no-contact order for both Rebecca and Mason. You return to Pennsylvania immediately and never attempt to contact either of them again. In exchange, we don't report your probation violation. James stared at the document, then looked up at me with naked hatred. You think you can blackmail me? After what you've done? After what I've done, I repeated, incredulous. I protected our son from a violent man who put me in the hospital, who threatened an infant, who has spent 16 years hunting us down, not out of love, but out of a twisted need for control. You took my son, James hissed, his calm facade cracking. You let me believe he was dead. I never told you he was dead, I corrected. I simply disappeared to keep him safe. And now that I know you spent years in prison for defrauding elderly clients, I'm even more certain I made the right decision. James's hands clenched into fists on the table, and I saw Ms. Patel shift nervously, her hand moving toward the phone that would summon security, but James controlled himself with visible effort. I've changed, he said, his voice softening in a way I remembered all too well, the contrite tone that had always followed his worst outbursts. I paid for my mistakes. I just want a chance to know my son. Mason spoke before I could respond. I don't want to know you. I don't need to know you. I have a life, friends, plans for college. None of those plans include you. James turned to him, and I saw him attempting to shift tactics, to appeal to Mason directly. Son, whatever she's told you, stop, Mason cut him off. I'm not your son, not in any way that matters. A father is someone who's there, who protects you, who puts you first. You're just DNA. The simplicity of Mason's statement hung in the air between us. James stared at him, seemingly at a loss for words for the first time since entering the room. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. James listened, his expression cycling through anger, frustration, and finally, a calculating acceptance. When he looked up again, the mask of civility had returned. I'll need time to consider this proposal, he said. You have 24 hours, Catherine replied promptly. After that, we report the probation violation and proceed with our request for a protective order. James stood abruptly. This meeting is over. I'll be in touch through my attorney. As he turned to leave, he paused, looking back at Mason with an expression I couldn't quite read. You look like me, he said. Same eyes, same build. Mason met his gaze unflinchingly. Maybe on the outside, but Mom made sure I'm nothing like you on the inside. Something flickered across James's face, a flash of genuine emotion breaking through the calculated exterior. For a moment, I thought he might respond. Instead, he straightened his jacket and walked out without another word, his lawyer hurrying after him. When the door closed behind them, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Catherine squeezed my arm gently. You both did beautifully, she said. Now we wait. Ms. Patel excused herself to see James and his lawyer out of the building, leaving the three of us alone in the conference room. The silence that followed felt charged with possibility, as though we were standing on the edge of something momentous. Do you think he'll sign? Mason asked finally. Catherine gathered her papers with careful precision. Men like your father calculate risks and benefits. The benefit of pursuing you is purely emotional. Revenge, control, whatever drives him. The risk is concrete. Violation of probation, return to prison. In my experience, when faced with such a choice, self-preservation usually wins. I looked at my son, seeing both the child I had protected and the man he was becoming. Whatever he decides, we're prepared. If he accepts our terms, this ends today. If he refuses, we fight. With the truth this time, not more secrets." Mason nodded, a small, determined smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "Either way, he doesn't get to control us anymore." As we left the mediator's office and stepped into the bright Pittsburgh morning, I felt lighter than I had in 16 years. James was no longer the all-powerful monster of my nightmares. He was just a man, flawed, damaged, dangerous still, but nothing we couldn't face together. For the first time since I'd fled Pennsylvania with an infant in my arms, I wasn't running anymore. I was standing my ground. 24 hours stretched into 36, then 48. Catherine assured us this was normal. James testing boundaries, trying to regain some sense of control by making us wait. But as the deadline passed without word from his attorney, she proceeded as planned, contacting his probation officer in Pennsylvania to report his presence in Pittsburgh. "What now?" I asked when she called to inform me the report had been made. "Now we wait," Catherine replied. "The system moves at its own pace." But I've also filed for an emergency hearing on the protective order. That's scheduled for tomorrow morning. The waiting was excruciating. Mason and I moved through our daily routines like actors following a script. He went to school, I went to work. We ate dinner together and talked about ordinary things. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, tension thrummed like an electrical current. Would James retaliate before the authorities caught up with him? Would he attempt to contact Mason at school? Every time my phone rang with an unknown number, my heart leaped into my throat. The morning of the protective order hearing arrived with no word about James's whereabouts. Catherine met us at the courthouse, her calm professionalism a steadying influence as we passed through security and found the correct courtroom. "This should be straightforward," she assured us. "Given the history of violence and the current harassment, I anticipate the judge will grant the order without difficulty." We were early, the courtroom nearly empty. Catherine directed us to seats near the front, then excused herself to speak with the clerk about our case. As she walked away, the courtroom door opened behind us. I turned automatically, then froze. James stood in the doorway, his eyes locked on mine. Beside him was not his lawyer, but Barbara, his mother. 16 years had turned her hair completely white, had stooped her once rigid posture, but her eyes held the same cold condemnation I remembered from the days after James's arrest. "Mom," Mason whispered, gripping my arm. "Is that his mother?" I confirmed quietly. "Your grandmother." James and Barbara made their way down the aisle, taking seats directly across from us. Barbara's eyes fixed on Mason, studying him with undisguised curiosity. I felt Mason stiffen beside me under her scrutiny. "James Anderson," the bailiff called. "Step forward." James rose, straightening his tie in a gesture so familiar it sent a chill down my spine. But instead of approaching the bench, he turned to face the scattered people in the courtroom. "Before we begin," he announced, "I want to make a statement." The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, frowned. "Mr. Anderson, this is not the appropriate time. For 16 years, James continued as if she hadn't spoken, this woman has kept my son from me, poisoned him against me, told him I was dead. Catherine was moving toward us now, her expression alarmed. The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Anderson, you will approach the bench now, or I will have you removed from my courtroom." James ignored her, his eyes fixed on me. "She claims I abused her, claims I threatened our child. Lies, all of it. Ask my mother. Ask anyone who knew us. Rebecca was unstable after Mason was born, paranoid, making accusations, threatening to leave." The bailiff was moving toward James now, but he raised his voice to be heard over the judge's repeated gavel strikes. "I made mistakes. I served my time. All I want is to know my son. Is that so wrong?" Mason stood suddenly, his height and unexpected movement drawing all eyes to him. The courtroom fell silent, even James pausing in his tirade. "Yes," Mason said, his voice clear and steady. "It is wrong, because you're not here for me. You're here to hurt her." James stared at his son, momentarily speechless. Mason continued, his composure remarkable for a 16-year-old addressing the father he'd never known in a courtroom full of strangers. "If you really cared about me, you would have tried to find me years ago. You would have sent child support, birthday cards, anything. Instead, you waited until you got out of prison for defrauding elderly people, then immediately tried to use me as a weapon against my mother." Barbara made a small noise of protest, but Mason's attention remained fixed on James. "I've seen the photograph," he continued. "I know what you did to her. I know you're violating your probation just by being here. So don't stand there talking about lies when you're the biggest liar in this room." The courtroom was utterly silent now, all eyes moving between Mason and James. Even the judge seemed too surprised by this turn of events to interrupt. James's face had drained of color, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling in the face of his son's calm condemnation. Barbara reached for his arm, whispering urgently, but he shook her off. "You don't understand," James said, his voice losing its confident edge. "She turned you against me. You don't know the whole story." "I know enough," Mason replied simply. "I know she kept me safe. I know she built a life for us. And I know I don't want anything to do with you." The bailiff had reached James now, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. The judge found her voice again. "Mr. Anderson, you are in contempt of this court. Bailiff, please escort him out. We will proceed with the hearing as scheduled." As the bailiff guided James toward the door, two men in suits entered the courtroom. One spoke quietly to the bailiff, showing identification. "Your Honor," the bailiff announced, "these gentlemen are federal marshals here to take Mr. Anderson into custody for violation of his probation terms." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge nodded her acknowledgement, and the marshals moved to flank James. "Wait," he protested, looking from the marshals to Mason with sudden desperation. "Mason, please. I'm your father." Mason shook his head slowly. "No, you're not. A father is someone who's there, someone who protects, not threatens, someone who puts their child first, not their own need for revenge." The simplicity of Mason's statement hung in the air. In that moment, something shifted in James's expression, a recognition, perhaps, that he had truly lost. Not just the legal battle, but any hope of establishing a relationship with his son. As the marshals led James away, Barbara remained seated, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. After a moment's hesitation, she rose and approached us. Catherine moved protectively closer, but I gestured for her to wait. "He's the image of James at that age," Barbara said quietly, her eyes on Mason, except around the eyes. "Those are yours." I said nothing, waiting. Mason stood tall beside me, neither reaching out nor backing away. Barbara seemed to age before our eyes, the rigid pride that had defined her melting into something more vulnerable. "I didn't believe you back then," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't imagine my son doing what you described. It was easier to think you were lying." "And now?" I asked, speaking to her for the first time in 16 years. Her eyes moved to the doorway where James had disappeared with the marshals. "Now I have 16 years of evidence to the contrary. The fraud conviction, the obsession with finding you, the way he spoke just now." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The words I had longed to hear for so many years landed strangely, neither as satisfying nor as healing as I had imagined. They came too late, after too much damage had been done, but they were still something, an acknowledgement, if nothing else. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, surprised to find I meant it. Barbara looked at Mason again, drinking in his features as though memorizing them. Would it be possible to know him? Not James, but me? To have some sort of relationship with my grandson? Before I could respond, Mason spoke. "Not now. Maybe someday, but not now. We need time." Barbara nodded, acceptance settling over her features. "I understand. If you ever change your mind..." She reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, holding it out to Mason. After a moment's hesitation, he took it. With a final nod to me, she turned and left the courtroom. The judge called our case shortly after, and as Catherine had predicted, granted the protective order without difficulty. James would not be permitted to contact either of us upon his release, though given the probation violation, that release might be years away. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the steps. Catherine shook both our hands, promising to keep us informed about any developments with James's case. "You were incredible in there," I told Mason as we walked to the car. "I don't know where you found that courage." He shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I learned it from you. 16 years of watching you be brave even when you were scared." His words touched something deep within me, a recognition that while I had spent years thinking I was protecting him, He had been watching, learning, growing into the person who could stand in that courtroom today and speak truth to power. As we drove home, a profound sense of peace settled over me. For the first time in 16 years, I didn't need to look over my shoulder. For the first time in 16 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of lies meant to protect my son. The truth, painful, complicated, messy, was finally breathing in the open air. "What happens now?" Mason asked as we pulled into our driveway. I considered his question, looking at the house we'd made our home, thinking of the life we'd built together. "Now," I said, "we live without fear. We build a future instead of running from the past." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. I liked the sound of that. Together, we walked into our house, closing the door on 16 years of hiding and opening it to whatever came next. 1 year later, I stood in our backyard, watching as Mason accepted his high school diploma on the small screen of my phone. The ceremony was being live-streamed for relatives who couldn't attend in person, but I had a front-row seat in the auditorium, my phone broadcasting to my parents in Ohio and to Laura in Denver. The past year had unfolded in ways I could never have predicted on that autumn day, when Mason discovered the photograph, and my carefully constructed lies began to unravel. James had been sentenced to serve the remainder of his original prison term, plus an additional year for violating probation. The judge had cited his obsessive pursuit of Mason and me as evidence that he remained a danger to society. The earliest he could be released was 2028, by which time Mason would be in college, legally an adult beyond James's reach. Barbara had respected our boundaries, sending only a card and check on Mason's birthday, and at Christmas. Mason had sent polite thank you notes, but nothing more. "Maybe next year," he had said, when I asked if he wanted to respond further. I'm still processing everything. The biggest changes had been within our home, within ourselves. After 16 years of secrecy, of carefully edited stories, of looking over my shoulder, I found myself almost dizzyingly free. I spoke openly about our past when asked. I stopped flinching when unfamiliar cars drove down our street. I went on my first real date in years, with a kind dentist named Michael who worked at a practice across town. Mason, too, had changed. The weight of anger he'd carried after learning the truth had gradually lightened. He'd started seeing a therapist specializing in family trauma, working through his complicated feelings about his father, about me, about the lies that had shaped his childhood. He'd joined a support group for teens with incarcerated parents, finding unexpected solace in sharing his story with others who understood parts of his experience. Most surprisingly, he'd chosen to write his college application essay about discovering the truth about his father. "It's part of who I am," he'd explained when I expressed concern. "Not the defining part, but still important. I don't want to hide it anymore." The essay had been powerful enough to earn him a scholarship to his first-choice university. In 2 months, he would be moving into a dormitory 3 states away, beginning the next chapter of his life with an openness I had never allowed myself. As the graduation ceremony ended and families began streaming toward the exits, I tucked my phone into my purse and made my way against the tide of people, searching for my son among the sea of blue caps and gowns. I found him taking photos with friends, his smile easy and genuine. "Mom," he called when he spotted me, waving me over. "Guys, I'll catch up with you at Brandon's later." His friends dispersed with congratulatory pats on his back, leaving us standing alone in the emptying auditorium. Mason pulled me into a tight hug, still wearing his graduation cap, the tassel tickling my cheek. "I'm so proud of you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "So incredibly proud." "I know," he replied, his own voice suspiciously husky. "You tell me every day." We made our way outside to the courtyard, where families were gathering for photos. The June sun was warm on our faces, the air sweet with the scent of fresh-cut grass and possibility. "I have something for you," I said, reaching into my purse. I pulled out a small box wrapped in silver paper. Mason raised an eyebrow, already having received his main graduation gift, a laptop for college, the previous weekend. "What's this?" he asked, taking the box. "Open it." He carefully removed the wrapping paper to reveal a jewelry box. Inside was a simple silver compass on a sturdy chain. He lifted it, turning it over in his palm. "It's beautiful," he said. "But why a compass?" I took a breath, organizing my thoughts. "When you were little, after we left Pennsylvania, I was so lost, terrified, alone, with no idea how to build a life for us. The only thing I knew for certain was that I had to keep you safe. Mason listened intently, the compass gleaming in the sunlight between us. I used to lie awake at night, wondering if I'd made the right choice, if running was better than staying and fighting, if the lies I told to protect you would someday hurt you worse than the truth. I touched the compass gently, but through all of that uncertainty, you were my true north. Every decision, every sacrifice, every lie and truth, they were all guided by my love for you. And now, as you head off to college, I wanted you to have something to remind you that no matter how lost you might feel sometimes, you have an inner compass too. Your own values, your own strength, your own truth. Mason's eyes glistened as he closed his hand around the compass. "Mom," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "You don't have to say anything," I assured him. He shook his head. "No, I want to. I need to." He took a deep breath. "Last year, when I found that letter, that photograph, I was so angry. I felt like my whole life had been a lie, like I didn't even know who I was anymore." I nodded, the familiar guilt rising again. "But I was wrong," he continued. "The stories changed, but the important things were always true. You always loved me. You always protected me. You always put me first." He closed his fingers around the compass. "And you taught me how to be strong, even when you thought you were just teaching me how to be safe." A group of graduates passed us, laughing and calling out congratulations to Mason. He waved back, then turned to me again. "I understand now why you did what you did," he said quietly. "I don't know if I would have had the courage to do the same in your position." "You would have," I said with absolute certainty. "You're the bravest person I know, Mason. Not because you're fearless, but because you face your fears and move forward anyway." He slipped the compass over his head, the silver catching the light as it settled against his graduation gown. "We should get going. Laura's flight gets in at 4, and Grandma and Grandpa will be arriving at the house soon." We walked toward the parking lot, Mason occasionally pausing to accept congratulations from teachers and classmates. As we reached the car, he stopped, turning to face me. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his expression suddenly serious. "I want to change my name." My heart stuttered. "Change your name?" He nodded. "Not my first name, my last name. I want to take yours, my real name, Mitchell. Not because I'm still hiding from him, but because that's who I am, who we are." The unexpected gift of his words left me momentarily speechless. After 16 years of fabricating a father worthy of him, Mason was choosing me, not just as his mother, but as his family, his identity, his legacy. "Are you sure?" I asked finally. "Completely," he replied without hesitation. "I've actually already looked into the process. It's pretty straightforward." I laughed, wiping away tears. "Of course you have. You've always been 10 steps ahead of me." As we drove home to the celebration awaiting us, I glanced at my son, soon to be officially Mason Mitchell, and marveled at the journey that had brought us here. From the terrified young mother fleeing with an infant, to the woman who had finally stopped running and faced her fears. From the little boy who believed his father was a hero, to the young man who had discovered a more complicated truth and emerged stronger for it. We had survived. Not just James's violence, not just 16 years of hiding, not just the painful unraveling of necessary lies, but the hardest challenge of all, finding our way back to truth, and to each other, on the other side. The road ahead would hold new challenges. Mason would leave for college, building his own life separate from mine for the first time. I would learn to navigate this new phase of motherhood, to find purpose and meaning beyond the all-consuming role of protector. James would eventually be released from prison, though Catherine had assured us that the protective orders would remain in place, and his age would make him less of a threat. But whatever came next, we would face it with open eyes and honest hearts. No more running, no more hiding, no more fear dictating our choices. "You know what I'm looking forward to most about college?" Mason asked as we turned onto our street. "What's that?" His smile was relaxed, genuine. "Introducing myself to new people. Hi, I'm Mason Mitchell. Simple, true. No backstory to remember, no lies to keep straight. Just me." As we pulled into our driveway, where balloons and a "Congratulations Graduate" banner hung from the porch, I realized that was the greatest gift to emerge from the painful truth we had faced together. The freedom to be fully, authentically ourselves. "Hi, Mason Mitchell," I said, smiling through tears of joy. "I'm Rebecca Mitchell." and I am so very honored to know you.